So here is a phrase that I coined myself. I call it boogeyman economics. Boogeyman economics is basically where you point to someone that you don't like, or some entity you don't like, perhaps some politician that you don't like, and you blame problems on them. And we see this happen very often in the public policy space, and we see it quite often whenever we talk about the environment. For example, there is a claim that the ism, whatever ism we're talking about that I don't happen to like, is destroying the planet. And what I would like to get you to do is stop thinking in terms of I have my ism and you have your ism and our isms are opposed. And instead, I want you to think like an economist. The way that I think as an economist is I look at these things the same way that an engineer looks at how a bridge is going to stay up. It's mechanical to me. It's physical. It's mathematical. And these are the things that we should look at instead of our isms. For example, here is an older article. Well, not that old. Here is an article on a website called The Guardian. I think it's a British website. And it's an opinion piece, and it's making the claim that an ism is killing the planet, and it's time to stop buying into our own destruction. Well, for everyone who can come up with an opinion piece and put forth arguments that an ism is killing the world and it's causing destruction, I can find another article like this one right here titled Why Socialism Causes Pollution. Now, this is a rather old one from the 1990s, it looks like, and I'm sure there's been updates on it. And this article does a fantastic job of going through and finding some examples, anecdotes of destruction to the environment caused by communist and socialist countries. And the reality is that you could counter that by coming up with a list of environmental problems that played out in free market, capitalist economies. So we should stop thinking about it in terms of this ism destroys the environment or that ism destroys the environment, and we should try to look at the actual root causes of environmental problems. The reality is that all environmental problems are the result of poorly defined property rights and or improperly assigned cost. What do we mean by that? Externalities. For example, negative externalities, specifically negative externalities, are costs borne by a third party, whereas positive externalities are benefits that accrue to a third party. The way I like to think about this is the airport. The nearest airport to us, my mother-in-law lives not far from that airport, and she is directly in the flight path of the airport. And all hours of the day and night, there are airplanes, huge airplanes, commercial-sized aircraft flying over her house. This is an example of an externality, specifically a negative externality. The individuals in the plane who participated in a market transaction and purchased the plane ticket put no thought into the people below them and the sound pollution caused by the airplane flying overhead. Likewise, the airline figured out the cost of flying that airplane and didn't put any thought into the economic damage done to the people in the flight path. That house has a lower value than a similar house that's not in the flight path. There's real economic damage caused. And any chance I can, I always turn back to the economist Thomas Sowell, who said, my favorite quote of all, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. So how do we solve an externality like that? Well, there's several ways to solve externalities like that. We talk about the Pigouvian tax, for example. The solution to those externalities all cost somebody money, but the idea here is we're going to take that cost that was borne by the third party and move it into the marketplace where the airline pays it. For example, if you're inside the house, you can't hear the airplanes because all the windows are triple pane glass. Well, who paid for that? Well, the airport did. And on another section of town, you can drive around and find a neighborhood with roads and fire hydrants and electrical connections. You can find the cutouts from the road into where a house should be. And there are no houses there. All of the lots are overgrown with no houses. Why? Well, the airport owns that property. That's an example of internalization. As you're flying the planes over that property, if the airport owns the property, then the airport only causes economic damage to itself. So there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Other examples of this, free riders. Free riders get to use a resource without paying for it. And because of that, they tend to overuse the resource. That's the issue with open access resources. Open access resources tend to be overused. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is the free rider doesn't pay. How do you fix it? You've got to find some way to impose a cost on the free rider. Once the free rider has to start paying for the resource, they stop overusing it. Anytime there's an open access resource, we have to worry about the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of commons basically says that open access resources tend to be overused. And one solution to that is to create property rights. Here is an example for you. How property rights and limited trophy hunting save the African white rhino. So rhinos, for some reason, are hunted because there's the belief that their horn does something magical. I'm not sure what it does, but apparently it's a valued item. The white rhino was saved from extinction because of a change in policy that allowed private ownership of wildlife while protecting the rhinos and encouraging farming of rhinos. The way I like to think about it is there are a lot of cows. Why are there so many cows? Cows are private property. A farmer can own a cow, use that cow to reproduce more cows, sell the calves, make money, and because of that, we have a large and healthy bovine population here in the United States. Well, the solution to saving the rhino is to simply allow people to own rhinos and let them farm rhinos. So the point here is that property rights and market incentives can actually protect endangered species. And a related concept is this thing called the Cobra effect. And there's a funny story behind the Cobra effect. I'm honestly not sure how true the story is, but it's a good story, so we're going to tell it anyways. So way back in the day when Britain had colonized and was in control of India, there was this British governor who decided that the town they were in had too many cobras, and he didn't like these cobras. They offended his British sensibilities, I suppose, even though they were common in India. He decided that we need to get rid of the cobras, so he put out a bounty on cobras and said, "Bring me dead cobras, we'll pay you." So people will now have an incentive to go out and hunt cobras. Well, you know, cobras are kind of dangerous, and I wouldn't advocate the hunting of them because that sounds like an unsafe activity. But there's another activity that's probably equally unsafe, and that is farming cobras. It turns out that it's actually easier to farm them than it is to hunt them. And when people realized that the government was paying money for cobras, people started farming them. And when the government figured out what was going on, they stopped the incentive program, and all the cobra farmers just released their cobras. So when they were done, there were more cobras than when they started. The lesson here is that if there's a financial incentive to grow an animal, people will follow out that financial incentive. So if you have an endangered species, you don't try to protect it, you incentivize the production of the endangered species by providing property rights so people can earn a living farming the endangered species. And if we're going to pick on an ism, I think it's important to point out that Karl Marx said that the theory of communism can be boiled down to this one sentence, and that is abolish all private property. And for me, the issue with the Marx-based isms is that all of those isms create massive disincentives to fixing environmental problems. Because in those systems, there's no ownership. Nobody's supposed to own any private property. And therefore, no one has the incentive to care for that private property. Let me give you a concrete example from agriculture. Are you familiar with a product called lime? If you've taken a soil class, you know what this is. It's basically grown-up limestone that you place on your soil in order to correct the pH of the soil. With the correct pH, your corn will uptake nitrogen more efficiently. The problem, though, is the first year you put it down, it's not terribly effective, and it takes a couple of years for it to become effective and several more years for it to really pay off. It's like a 5 to 10 year investment putting lime on your field. If you're renting property, you have zero incentive to manage the pH of that property. Because if you put the lime down this year and someone else gets the farm next year, you don't get the benefit from the money you've spent. But if you've got a long-term lease, 10, 15 years, or if you own the property, you have the incentive to manage the soil better. Let's talk recycling. Before we talk recycling, I want to mention something right here. This is the website for an organization called the Heterodox Academy. It is a group of professors and students that are members of this organization. And their vision and their mission is to improve the quality of research and education in universities by open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement. And I'm having a little bit of fun with this lecture because I'm doing a little bit of devil's advocate. When I think about something like global warming, right? What is the actual cause of global warming? Well, there's a story that tells you the cause of global warming. And I mentioned in my video on global warming that if you look at, say, the work of Bjorn Lomborg, maybe global warming is not the massive catastrophe that everyone says it is. Well, that is what we call a constructive disagreement. I'm playing devil's advocate here. How I actually feel about these things is completely irrelevant. The reality here is that we need to think about alternative viewpoints and stop and ask ourselves, what's the evidence and who is correct? So I'm going to put forth some thoughts right here about recycling that fly in the face of conventional wisdom. And my hope is that you will, on your own, do a little bit of digging and see if you believe the conventional wisdom about recycling, the orthodoxy of recycling, or if you believe that there's good evidence for an alternative view on recycling, the heterodox view on recycling. And I don't care which viewpoint you take. I want you to think the way that an economist would think, which is looking at incentives, weighing the evidence, looking at costs, looking at benefits, looking at trade-offs. Because as Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. So what's the solution to all the waste we generate? Maybe it's recycling. Okay, what are the trade-offs involved in recycling? What does it cost to recycle things? So here is an article that I think is interesting. Relatively recent. This is a 2022 article on NPR, and the headline is that recycling plastic is practically impossible and the problem is getting worse. And this appears to be an article based on some data published by, I think it was Greenpeace. Well, it turns out that we push recycling a lot, but most things that get thrown away don't actually meet the standards to be recyclable. In fact, you want to have a little conspiracy theory? Here's an article in Time magazine that says that big oil sold the world on a plastics recycling myth, and it may be too late to undo the damage. So it's got to be a catastrophe, right? If it's not a catastrophe, it doesn't make a good headline. Not only do we have this myth and this boogeyman that sold us a myth, we have a catastrophe that we can't undo, right? Do you see how the headline is trying to sell you on something? Well, let's read the article. I'll give you links to these. There is some documentation out there that shows that apparently the idea of recycling, the little recycling 3 twisty arrow image that's on all plastics, was actually a big PR campaign that was created by the plastics industry to get people to believe that recycling was feasible and therefore to worry less about buying things made out of plastic. Interesting story. So this is an article published on the website of the American Institute for Economic Research. And the author of the article was a skeptic of recycling and was invited to come and speak at a trade event related to recycling. And he related the story. The story he told was basically that he believed he was invited to be a tethered goat, a sacrificial lamb. He was sure that he was walking into a trap, and he stands up and he gives his contrary opinion that, hello, people in the recycling industry, what you're doing is actually quite useless. Their reaction was, well, They didn't seem to be too bothered by that. And he claims he was quite stunned by the lack of controversy. And he sought out some people and asked some questions. He goes to one person, anonymous. When we have a quote and we don't say who said the quote, we don't know if the quote's real. So, let's think about our evidence here. Oh, we all know it makes no sense to recycle. The economic case is easy, but people should still recycle because it's simply the right thing to do. It's not about the actual environment. It's about enlisting people to care about the symbol of the environment. Overall, recycling is still worth doing regardless of its effects. Another individual says it's okay to say that sort of thing, referring to the this doesn't work sort of thing here, because we're insiders. But it's better not to talk about the economics of things to the general public. We need to help train them to care about the environment, and recycling is one of the best ways to do that. And the gentleman had written another article similar to this way back a long time ago in 2007, ages ago, right? It's got a very old idea. And the quote from that article that he got from somebody was, "You have to understand, recycling is always cheaper, no matter how much it costs." And to quote the author of this article, "The message I had worried about and expected to be controversial was old hat to the industry folks, but it was beside the point because recycling was for them a moral imperative. Once you begin to think of recycling as a symbol of religious devotion rather than a pragmatic solution to environmental problems, the whole thing, the lack of actual economic evidence that it's a good idea, makes no sense." This same author has an interesting way of thinking about this as well. He says that there's two things. There's garbage and there's a resource. How do you tell the difference? You have to pay someone to take your garbage, but people will pay you for your resource. So here's a quote from Adam Smith. Adam Smith is regarded to be the founder or father of economics, and he wouldn't have called himself an economist. He would have called himself a moral philosopher. In fact, his first book was called The Theory of Moral Sentiment, and I'm pretty certain this quote came from the theory of moral sentiment. "Virtue is more to be feared than vice because its excesses are not subject to the regulation of conscience." The quote is as applicable today as it is when Smith first wrote it. When you listen to people make arguments in favor of recycling, it's usually moral persuasion. It is usually the argument that it is the right thing to do. The problem is that it is not the efficient thing to do. And an economist would prefer that we do what is efficient. For example, the street that I live on, the local municipality, sends a truck around one day a week to pick up all the garbage. Everyone takes their garbage, puts it in a big bucket with wheels on it, and rolls it out to the street. A big truck comes along, an arm comes out, lifts it up, hauls it off to the dump. And on that exact same day, there are people who pay for recycling services, and a second big truck from a recycling company comes around and basically doubles down on the amount of pollutants from the diesel fuel being spewed out into our environment. You see, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And the question we should be asking ourselves is not what is the right thing to do, it is what is the efficient thing to do. That is the economic perspective. And that's the perspective that I want to leave you with, and I hope that it makes a little bit of sense.